December 25th, 1991, a date that ended an era. Mikhail Gorbachev sat before television cameras in the Kremlin, delivering his final address as leader of the Soviet Union. His words carried the exhaustion of a man who had watched an empire crumble. Outside, workers were already removing the Soviet Union flag from its pole. Within hours, one of history's great superpowers would cease to exist. The world rushed to explain what had happened. Newspapers called it communism's defeat. Academics declared that it's totalitarian's inevitable failure. Politicians claimed democracy's triumph. But inside the Soviet Ministry of Finance, accountants knew a different truth. The ledgers told a simple story, one written in red ink. The Soviet Union didn't die from philosophical weakness. It died because its treasury was empty. This is how a nation armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilizations 7 times over couldn't afford to feed its people. To understand this collapse, we must travel to 1965, to western Siberia, a frozen hell where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius and the ground that hasn't thawed in millennia. Soviet geological teams were drilling through permafrost, searching for valuable resources beneath the ice. What they found would transform their nation's fate: the Samotlar oil field. As they continued surveying, they realized the magnitude. They had found 16 billion barrels of recoverable crude, one of the largest oil discoveries in human history. This seemed like salvation. By the mid-1960s, Soviet manufacturing was failing badly. Factories couldn't produce consumer goods that worked. Citizens waited years for cars that immediately broke down. Soviet electronics was laughable compared to Western products. The quality gap had become embarrassing. But oil made those problems seem irrelevant, because why fix factories when you could pump wealth from the ground? Soviet engineers built long pipeline networks, connecting Siberian fields to European customers thousands of kilometers away. Then the 1970s changed everything. The 1973 Arab oil embargo sparked a global energy crisis. Prices jumped from $3 per barrel to $12 and then kept climbing. After Iran's 1979 revolution disrupted supplies, oil exceeded $35 per barrel, a tenfold increase in less than 10 years. For Moscow, this was the greatest windfall in Russian history. Hard currency flooded in, over $30 billion annually at peak. The money seemed limitless. The prosperity seemed permanent. But this wealth poisoned the USSR. It made reform unnecessary because why change anything when petrodollars solved every problem? The oil boom transformed the Soviet economy dangerously. By the late 1970s, they had evolved from an industrial power into a petro-state, an economy dependent on resource extraction rather than manufacturing. They had become essentially a third-world commodity exporter with nuclear weapons. They extracted oil and gas, sold it abroad, and then imported almost everything else. Think about the absurdity. This nation launched the first satellite and sent humans to space, yet their economy now functioned like an oil emirate, entirely dependent on what came from underground. The petrodollars funded everything. The Kremlin subsidized bread prices, losing billions to keep food artificially cheap. Housing was nearly free. Utilities cost almost nothing. Beyond their borders, they bankrolled communist governments throughout Eastern Europe and client states worldwide, like Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, Syria, Nicaragua. Military spending accounted for 15 to 20% of the GDP. They maintained nuclear parity with America despite having a far smaller economy. This entire structure depended on one thing: high oil prices. As long as crude stayed above $30 per barrel, everything worked. They could fund their military, sustain their empire, and project global power. The Soviet Union had become an addict. Expensive oil was a drug. They couldn't imagine life without it. While oil masked problems, agriculture was collapsing. This represents the most humiliating aspect of the Soviet story. The Soviet Union contained planet's most fertile land, Ukraine's legendary black soil, yet they couldn't feed themselves. The collective farm system was catastrophically inefficient. Roughly 30 to 40% of harvests never reached stores. Grain rotted in storage, vegetables froze in transit. The waste was extraordinary. So a nuclear power had to import food from enemies. By early 1980s, food import costed $15 to $20 billion annually, nearly half of their oil revenues. American wheat, Canadian grain, and Argentine corn. The circulatory was absurd. Sell oil to Europe, buy wheat from America, repeat endlessly. A nation capable of ending civilization depended on weekly grains shipments from its primary adversary. Soviet leaders looked at oil charts and felt secure. The money would keep flowing, the boom would last forever. However, they were tragically wrong. March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader. At 54, he is young and reform-minded. He launches perestroika, economic restructuring to modernize Soviet industry. But modernization requires massive investment. Finance ministry projections show oil revenues will fund everything. The plan seemed solid. Then March 13, 1985 arrived. Saudi Arabia's oil minister announced that the kingdom would abandon production limits. Saudi crude would flood global markets. Prices imploded. January 1986, $12 per barrel. March, $12. July, below $10. A 70% crash in just 6 months. For the Soviet Union, this was catastrophic. They had lost half of their income overnight. Imagine losing half of your salary while every bill stays the same. That was their condition at superpower scale. The timing was apocalyptic. The price crash hit as money drained from everywhere simultaneously. In Afghanistan, Soviet forces were trapped in guerrilla war since 1979. The conflict was costing billions annually. Equipment, supplies, medical care. Afghanistan was USSR's Vietnam. Then there was arms race. Reagan's Star War programs threatened Soviet nuclear weapons with space-based defense. Military leaders demanded matching investments, which resulted in more billions being spent. Just like America, the USSR also had a global empire. They continued subsidizing communist regimes worldwide, which resulted in more billions flowing out. Then there was food imports. Grain ships kept arriving, demanding payments in dollars, not worthless rubles that nobody accepted outside the Soviet Union. Gorbachev faced impossible choices: cut military spending, which would risk a coup, cut food subsidies and face riots, and defaulting on debts would destroy credibility forever. So he chose borrowing. Western banks eagerly lent to a superpower that had never defaulted. But this wasn't investment capital. They borrowed just to buy food, to keep shelves from emptying completely. They were financing survival on credit. Then Gorbachev made a catastrophic mistake. In 1985, he launched an anti-alcohol campaign. Soviet alcoholism was genuinely destroying productivity and health. He restricted vodka sales and destroyed vineyards. Morally, it was right, but economically, it was disastrous. Alcohol taxes generated 12 to 15% of state revenue, second only to oil. Gorbachev had eliminated another massive income source. However, people didn't stop drinking. They brewed moonshine. Sugar vanished from stores. The deficit exploded. By 1988, the government was printing money desperately. Rubles flooded the economy, but shelves were empty. Citizens had money, but nothing was there to buy. Queues formed before dawn. You joined any line without knowing what was sold. Shoes, soaps, sausages. Because tomorrow it would be gone. The social contract shattered. For 70 years, the government had promised that if you obey us, we'll provide stability. But now they couldn't deliver, so trust evaporated. By 1989, Western banks were alarmed. Soviet debt exceeded $50 billion and was growing. Worse, they had borrowed to pay interest on previous loans. This was the classic sign of impending default. Then political earthquake struck. November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Eastern European communist governments collapsed. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The West celebrated, but for Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe. Inside the Soviet Union, republics rebelled. They stopped sending tax revenues to Moscow. Boris Yeltsin told Russian enterprises to keep their money locally. The central government was being hollowed out. By 1990, Gorbachev commanded nuclear weapons but couldn't pay the guards. Teachers received no salaries, pensioners got no checks. The state was disintegrating. Desperately, they sold gold reserves. Planes flew gold bars to London and Zurich for cash. They sold so aggressively that they crashed the gold price. But still, it was not enough. In 1990, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union defaulted. Ships carrying food refused to unload until payments were cleared. Soviet checks bounced. Accounts froze. Creditors seized assets. The ruble stopped functioning. The economy reverted to barter. Factories traded products directly. Cigarettes became currency. Dollars replaced rubles on streets. In August 1991, communist hardliners attempted a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow. But tanks can't solve bankruptcy. The coup collapsed in just 3 days. By late 1991, government couldn't pay anyone. Printing presses ran continuously, generating hyperinflation. The central bank was insolvent. The treasury was empty. December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned on television, not from military defeat or revolution, but because he led a government that could no longer function. It couldn't pay bills, it couldn't meet obligations, it couldn't continue existing. The Soviet Union ceased to exist because it ran out of money. Russia inherited $96 billion in Soviet debt. The 1990s brought devastation. Savings evaporated, poverty exploded, life expectancy plummeted. Russia paid the entire outstanding debt by 2017. It took 26 years to close the account of a dead empire. The Cold War's end reveals something profound about power. Nuclear weapons don't guarantee survival. Ideology doesn't determine fate. Economics does. The Soviet Union had missiles that could reach any target on Earth. They had brilliant scientists, vast resources, enormous military might, but they built everything on a single commodity. When its price collapsed, nothing else could save them. They didn't need external enemies to destroy them. They just needed an oil price crash and grain shipment they couldn't afford. The hammer and sickle didn't fall to American military superiority or ideological warfare. It went bankrupt, one bounce check at a time. This is history's lesson. You can threaten to end the world, but if you can't pay for bread, you are finished. Empires don't always fall with explosions and drama. Sometimes they simply run out of money. The Soviet Union proved that the most powerful weapon isn't nuclear, it's economic stability. Without it, even superpowers crumble. The greatest bankruptcy in history wasn't caused by revolution or invasion. It was caused by addiction to a single resource, and the catastrophic moment when that resource value disappeared. The Soviet Union had become a junkie state, and when the dealer, the global oil market, cut them off, withdrawal was fatal. This wasn't just the collapse of communism, it was the collapse of an economic model that ignored every fundamental principle of sustainable growth. They had traded long-term strength for short-term wealth, and when the wealth vanished, there was nothing left behind to hold the empire together. The red flag came down not because of American pressure, but because nobody could afford to keep it flying. If you found this insightful, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.